Welcome back, everyone. Today's lesson is a two-week lesson. We're going to be talking about dependent clauses and complex sentences. Now, if you've never seen these before, it could be a little bit complex. However, I think after we practice it, after you look at some examples, I think it'll get a little bit easier. Now, why do we have complex sentences? Basically, you don't want to always have simple sentences, subject, verb, period. You don't want to have those all the time. You want to kind of express yourself in fuller ways, in more detail. And so when we do that, you need to make your sentences longer. And one way to do that is with complex sentences. However, before you learn how to make a complex sentence, you need to understand what is a dependent clause, because these are key when you are trying to make a complex sentence. Let's look at some definitions. So what is a clause? A clause is a group of words that has a subject noun and a verb. Now, the reason why we have a subject noun here is because you could have a dependent clause that has a subject, verb, and object. However, you need to have at least a subject noun. If you just have an object noun, that's not a clause. That is actually a phrase. So we usually call those objects the objects of the preposition if it's a prepositional phrase. So you need to have a subject noun and a verb for it to be a clause. But we are going to learn two different kinds of clauses today. The dependent clause. What does dependent mean? Dependent means that you cannot stand by yourself, you cannot stand alone, you need some help. And that is what a dependent clause is. It is not a complete thought, so it is not a sentence. It needs some help for it to be part of a sentence. So we're going to call those DCs in the future. So if you hear me say I see DC, DC just means a dependent clause. So if a dependent clause is not a complete thought, then what is an IC? An IC is an independent clause. An independent clause is a complete thought. Now, you've heard our definitions before. What is a sentence? A sentence is a complete thought, but it also needs to have a punctuation at the end, and in the beginning it needs to have a capital letter. Then you turn an independent clause into a sentence, okay? So even though an independent clause, it looks like a sentence, it sounds like a sentence, but until you have a punctuation at the end and a capitalization, it is not a sentence. It is just an independent clause. This next part here, complex sentence, that's this. We're going to look at some examples soon, but here is how we make a complex sentence. You need to have at least one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. Later we can talk about how to actually have more clauses and still make it complex, but there are two patterns. If you have an independent clause and then a dependent clause, you can just put a period at the end and you're done. You can switch those. Instead of having ICDC, you can start with a dependent clause, but you need this. It's very important. This little tiny mark, it's called a comma. You need this if you start with a dependent clause. So it's got to be DC, comma, IC if you're going to make this version of a complex sentence. So, what makes a dependent clause? A dependent clause has to have a dependent clause marker. We're going to also call these DCMs, okay? Like these words, though and unless. Though also has though, although, and even though. So though, unless, when, whenever, because, and so, if, as if, then, before, after, since, until, while, as, and many, many, many more. But these are your more common dependent clause markers. If you have any of these words before an independent clause, that makes it a dependent clause. Does that make sense? Maybe not, but we'll look at that in our examples and I will show you what I mean. Because the only difference between a dependent and independent clause, whether it is not a complete thought or it is a complete thought, is one of these words. Okay? So we'll get to that in our examples, so stick around. So let's look at some examples for our dependent clauses and complex sentences. Now we just saw these dependent clause markers. There's many, many more, but these are some of the common ones that you use. And remember, when you make a complex sentence, you need two parts. You need to have an independent clause, which could stand alone as a sentence, and a dependent clause, which needs some help. It needs to be part of an independent clause for it to actually come together to make a complex sentence. The thing is, though, it doesn't matter which one you start with first. Now, that's basically how you want to express your idea. You could choose to start with the independent clause and finish with the DC, or you could start with the DC and then go to the IC. But what you have to remember is this. If you have IC and DC, you need to have a punctuation mark at the end, period, question mark, exclamation point. But if you have a DC that begins your complex sentence, this is absolutely necessary. You need to have a comma if you're going to start with a DC and then go to your IC. So IC, DC, punctuation, or DC, comma, IC, punctuation. Just remember that one. So let's look at a couple examples. Remember, a clause has to have a subject noun and a verb. It could have an object, but it definitely needs to have a subject noun. So our first sentence, I will go to school when the bus comes. Okay? So there's actually two clauses here, and you should be able to find them. So I will go to school. I'm going to put this. The bus comes. Because the when, this is a DCM. This is a dependent clause marker. So this is how you know. This goes to school, or when the bus comes, these go together instead of I will go to school when. That's not how your clause finishes, okay? Clauses will start with a subordinating conjunction or a DCM. So when the bus comes, this is your DC, this is your IC, so there is no comma. I will go to school when the bus comes. Switch it. How do we do that? When the bus comes, comma, I will go to school, punctuation. And of course, you have to capitalize the DCM, subordinating conjunction, okay? So that's number one. Number two, since I have no money, I can't buy it. I can't buy it is your independent clause. Since I have no money, since is your DCM, dependent clause marker. So this one needs to have the comma, okay? So since I have no money, comma, I can't buy it. You don't need to have a period, but you could have an exclamation. Depends on how angry you are about not having enough money to buy what you want to buy. Switch this again. I can't buy it, no comma, since I have no money, punctuation. Make sense? Easy? Hope so. This last one, I'm going to give you your options here. Because look at both of these. These are clauses. We told each other ghost stories. We sat around the campfire. They look the same. They're not sentences. Why are they not sentences? What do you need? Some kind of punctuation at the end. And here, you need a capitalization for this to be a sentence. Right now, it's just independent clause, independent clause. Now remember I told you that the only difference from an independent clause and a dependent clause is a dependent clause marker? Well, that's where this comes in. Any of these could be turned into a dependent clause. Let's say I want to use the word while. Okay? I could say, while we told each other ghost stories. This is an independent clause, but if you add this word, or any of these words, this becomes a dependent clause. Same thing. While we sat around the campfire is now a dependent clause. Take out the while, take out the DCM, it's an independent clause. So if you want to put this together, I could start with a DC, comma, IC, which means I need one of these words. So, while we told each other ghost stories, comma, we sat around the campfire, punctuation, I'll use a period. Or, we sat around the campfire while we told each other ghost stories. Okay, so that's just using IC, DC. Well, how about using the while here instead? It's still the same idea of a sentence. So we told each other ghost stories while we sat around the campfire, right? I just switched which one of these is going to be your dependent clause, okay? And that's kind of the fun. All you need to do is find the independent clause, and if you can find those, then you can just add a DCM and turn that into a dependent clause. I hope this helps. Let's review. Dependent clauses and complex sentences. What is a clause? A clause is a group of words that has a subject noun and a verb. It may or may not be a complete thought. What is a dependent clause, DC? It is a clause that is not a complete thought. What is an independent clause, IC? It is a clause that is a complete thought, but it is not a sentence. Why is an independent clause not a sentence? An independent clause needs a capital letter at the beginning and a punctuation mark at the end. What are the two patterns to make a complex sentence? Independent clause, dependent clause, punctuation mark, or dependent clause, comma, independent clause, punctuation mark. What is a dependent clause marker, DCM? A DCM is a word that comes before an independent clause, which changes it into a dependent clause. What are some examples of dependent clause markers, DCM? Though, unless, when, whenever, because, so, if, then, before, after, since, until, while, as, and more.